interviewing Kasey Pipes. He wrote a great book called Ike's Final Battle, and we had him speak last night. And today is, what is today? It's the 31st of January. And I'm taking him to the airport, and we're inaugurating a series called Road Scholars. Kasey, why did you write Ike's Final Battle?
Well, I thought this is a great story of really the greatest American hero of his time confronting the greatest American dilemma of all time. And I thought in particular, when you look at the Eisenhower scholarship, there's been a lot written about the war, there's been some written about the presidency, but there's been very little written about civil rights. And that was the greatest American dilemma of all time since the founding of the Republic. And Eisenhower actually made a very significant contribution on the issue. And I thought it was time to take a second look at it. And what I found is he has a very honorable record that deserves more credit than it's gotten.
Did you find something that really surprised you in the course of your research?
I think the extent to which that he was so methodical and so workmanlike in dealing with the issue. Most of the conventional wisdom has said that he was constantly reacting, that he was surprised by some of the things that happened in the 50s. I found none of that to be true, and on the contrary, he actually anticipated as early as January or June of 1953, he anticipated in his diary with an entry that he wrote that there might be a little rock, that the tempers were pretty high, passions were running high, and that if he didn't move very carefully and cautiously, he might actually have a confrontation, and that was something he wanted to avoid. So I was surprised the extent to which not only was he not asleep at the wheel, as conventional wisdom says, but actually anticipated events precisely as they happened.
What do you think his specific leadership qualities were that enabled him to make such an important decision successfully?
You know, there's a number of factors of the Eisenhower leadership model that I really admire. He often said, in fact, he said in one of his books, in a bit of advice to young people, always surround yourself with people who are smarter than you and who know more than you, because they can fill in the gaps. And so Eisenhower, as president, always had a team of first-rate staffers around him, particularly on civil rights issues. He had Attorney General Herbert Brownell, arguably one of the finest attorney generals ever, and he engaged in a real interaction. In many ways, Eisenhower is a throwback. You go back and look at the minutes to his cabinet meetings, it reads like a 19th century president. There's a real give and take. There's sort of a group discussion about policy matters. And in the end, the president would make the decision, but he very much wanted input from others. He asked very direct questions. He tried to look at all of the options. And then once the time came, he made a decision and he went with it. And I think all of those factors served him very well and really would serve any president well even today.
You made the case, I thought, extremely eloquently last night in your keynote address at the Ford Museum, that as you researched this book, it morphed for you. It started out being a case study about this American dilemma, and it became something much different by the end of the book. Would you please go into that a little bit?
Well, I had originally thought that doing a book on Little Rock would be really interesting, and doing sort of a case study of that. And as I got into it, I really became less interested in the politics of Little Rock than in the personality and character of Eisenhower. I became less concerned about what Eisenhower said about civil rights than with what civil rights said about Eisenhower. And the way that he found himself in the middle of this very difficult issue, and the way he tried to wrestle with it and find his way through it, find a way to promote minority rights, promote civil rights, but yet in a way that did not produce a reaction, in a way that wasn't counterproductive, in a way that didn't produce a Little Rock, as I mentioned. Now, he still got a Little Rock, but he didn't hesitate when it happened, and he was very decisive. So I was surprised in getting into it at how compelling a figure he was, how compelling a leader he was, particularly in the midst of a crisis. And I just became, as I said, less interested in Central High and more interested in Eisenhower. And I think I'm really glad it turned out that way. I suspect probably any author would tell you that their book changes as they begin writing it, and this one certainly did.
Why hasn't President Eisenhower gotten his due? historically? Why isn't he given more credit for being really a progressive civil rights president, reluctant though he may have been initially?
Well, there's a number of reasons for that. One is ideologically. I mean, Eisenhower in many ways shared the same goals of the civil rights movement, but he wanted to pursue those goals in a very conservative way. He thought that the best way to enact change was slowly, organically, over time, respecting the customs and traditions of the country. And if you were an African American living in Selma, Alabama in 1955, that's probably pretty little consolation. You want something faster and bigger than that. So there was always a difference between Eisenhower and the civil rights movement over the pace of change and the approach to change, even though they agreed on the goals. Also, Eisenhower himself, being a modest man, never really took credit. He didn't want to pat himself on the back, particularly Little Rock. He viewed Little Rock as a failure. Anytime a president has to send troops into an American city to uphold the law, that's not a great moment that you're proud of. And so Eisenhower didn't like to talk about it, and because he didn't talk about it, no one else talked about it. No one else gave him a lot of credit. And I just think that all of those reasons have contributed to him not getting his due in history, and I think now we're finally beginning to see a second look, which I hope the book has helped spur, and I think when people do give him a second look, they'll be surprised and they'll be impressed.
You, as a writer, pay a great deal of attention to story, and I want to come back to that in a minute. But every good story has a hero and a villain. Now, the hero of your story is obviously Dwight Eisenhower, among other people. Who are the villains in this story?
There's a number of them. Obviously, the section of the book that deals with Little Rock, and there's several chapters that deal with Little Rock, Orville Faubus is the villain there. Faubus was the Democratic governor of Arkansas. Actually, he ironically had a very honorable record on civil rights leading up to 1957, but he got a scare in the primary in 1956 from a sort of a racist Dixiecrat type candidate, Jim Johnson, and he got a third of the vote against an incumbent governor, Orville Faubus. So Faubus got religion. He decided to co-opt the issue. He essentially becomes a segregationist overnight, and at Little Rock he sees the chance of a lifetime. I mean, here he can solidify all of the white voters in Arkansas in one moment, and that's exactly what he did. And for the rest of his life, he had very high approval ratings. He was reelected several times in Arkansas, although nationally and internationally he was a pariah. So he's the villain of the Little Rock section, and I think rightly so. He never, to the day he died, never apologized, never regretted anything he did at Little Rock. And in fact, he showed up at a conference at the Eisenhower Center in Kansas in 1990 and bitterly complained about how he had been tricked and Brownell set him up. And so he utterly was unrepentant to the end. The other sort of interesting, I don't know that I'd use the word villain, but the other person that's sort of juxtaposed with Eisenhower as the hero is Eisenhower himself. And I spend a lot of time in the book showing the internal struggle of the better angels of Eisenhower's nature, wrestling with his background. Having been born in Texas in 1890, having been raised in a white town in Kansas in the early 1900s, being the product of an all-white West Point academy, being the product of a military academy, of a military environment that was very white and in many ways very racist. Eisenhower had a lot of baggage, and so he's wrestling with his own background and his own prejudice, and yet the great part of the story is he wins. He overcomes himself, and he becomes, although a reluctant hero, a hero nonetheless. And by the time he's a retired elder statesman in Gettysburg in the 1960s, he's furious at his own party for abandoning the Lincoln tradition, the civil rights tradition. He's furious with Goldwater for opposing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So he came a long way during his lifetime, and that's a great story for all of us, because all of us have challenges, all of us have wrongs that we try to right in our own life, and Eisenhower shows us that it can be done.